Hello, my name is Rebecca Nunu, and I am a research scientist at Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio, Texas. And before we get started, I just want to shout out Greg Perrin, Reeves County, Groundwater Conservation District, and everyone involved in planning this great event. I'm so happy to see so many people show up, and I'm truly honored to be a part of it. So thank you for including me. As Doc Ward mentioned, the geology in this area is really complex, and consequently, so is the water, right? It's all interconnected. And so Southwest Research, me and Ron specifically, have been focused on looking at the chemistry of San Solomon Springs since 2019, just to better understand where exactly it's coming from and what we can do to protect it. So with that being said, the title of my talk is The Application of a Geochemical Framework for Water Resource Management in a Semi-Arid Landscape with specific focus on San Solomon. So as we all know, increasing demands and limited supplies present severe challenges to sustainable development to many parts of the world. And so taking a long-range look at our water supply is important now more than ever. Pictured here is the U.S. Drought Monitor from 2011, and as we can see, Texas is pretty much all characterized by was characterized by exceptional drought during this time. And in recent past, it's been very hot and very dry as well, maybe not as bad as it was in 2011, but what happens when we keep having these persistent drought conditions, less rain, drier conditions in our area? And on top of that, what happens when 12 of the 15 fastest growing cities in the US are largely in semi-arid and arid regions like Texas? So with that being said, our arid regions like West Texas are particularly vulnerable to water supply risk. So with that being said, in order to effectively manage our water, we have to understand it. We have to understand, like Doc Ward said, the story that's being manifested in our water, such as springs, wells, rivers, and such. And the only way we can effectively manage our water is if we understand that story, especially as we face, changes in groundwater withdrawals and recharge. And there are a number of tools that we as hydrologists and geologists use in order to effectively manage or characterize our water. We'll hear shortly about using water level mapping or physical hydrology to better understand our water resources. There are other tools like dye tracer tests that we can use as well, resistivity surveys. But the topic of today's talk, or the tool that we use in this project, is geochemistry, which can be really valuable because you can start to see some of the subtle differences that may not be as easily noticed using other methods. So what exactly is a geochemical framework? In the context of this work, it is a structured approach where we're using geochemical analyses, statistical analyses, and modeling in order to identify different source areas and flow paths to discharge points. And like I said, that could be a well, it could be a spring, it could be a river. But what makes a geochemical framework so impactful is the collection and interpretation of robust geochemical data. So specifically, we are collecting an extensive suite of geochemical constituents. Like Doc Ward said, that includes our major ions, it includes isotopes and things that we measure at the site, like temperature or TDS. It also includes sampling over a wide spatial coverage or a large geographic area. And on top of that, collecting data over over an extended period of time, so we can see how geochemistry may or may not be changing over time. So, we're in Reeves County, and I'm sure most of us know about San Solomon Springs. It's the water in the desert, and it's a topic and study area of our talk today. Here we are in West Texas. Here's Reeves County. The San Solomon Springs system is located right along the Jeff Davis-Reeves County border. And although the title or the topic of today's talk is San Solomon Springs, it's not the only iconic spring system that exists in this area. We've also been looking at the Comanche Spring system located in Fort Stockton. And although the topic of today's talk is San Solomon, I should point out that we're also using a similar approach for these iconic springs in Fort Stockton too. So San Solomon Springs is pretty cool because it's got multiple outlets in such a small area. So it includes Phantom Lake, Giffen, and San Solomon. These are our larger springs. This is where the state park is, as well as Saragossa, East Sandia, and West Sandia that are right in town. And these springs are really important to the economy and the communities of Balmorhea because they provide for irrigation, municipal, and recreational uses. So back to Doc Ward's talk, and we're, like I can't promise I'm not going to use a lot of terms, so I'm starting to get into them, but the structure in this area is really complicated. We have multiple aquifers, both major and minor. They all are similar source rocks. There are a lot of carbonates that are situated in this area, and there's a lot of faulting or structural features that impact flow. And so this study, or the springs have been studied since the 40s. I think it's been of paramount importance to the communities to better understand where the springs are sourced from for over a century, but our conceptualization of where flow is coming from has substantially evolved over time. So in the 40s, there was a study done that basically came up with the idea that the springs are likely coming from the Jeff Davis Mountains, right, in Jeff Davis County. But geochemistry has been used to evolve our understanding of where this flow is coming from. And so, long story short, the waters in the Apache Mountains were noticed to be very similar to that of San Solomon. And so this study that came out in 2007 basically ascertained that there are these large regional flow paths that come along the Stocks Fault from the Apache Mountains and the Wild Horse Flat to ultimately feed to the springs. And on top of that, they identified these other local flow paths, so basically other sources that may not be as large as this regional flow path, that come from the Davis Mountains and the Rustler Aquifer. But what they missed out is trying to look at the springs individually to see if they're all from the same source. Do we see differences over time, different local flow paths that may be contributing to each individual spring? Does this model or does this conceptualization hold up over time, especially in the wake of development? So with that being said, since 2019, we've been looking at collecting geochemical data to better understand, and the objective of this project, to better understand the hydraulic relationships among the individual springs using geochemical and multivariate statistics to answer this question: do different local and or regional sources contribute to each of the 6 springs in Balmorhea? So our technical approach includes, like I said, the collection of an expanded suite of geochemical markers, which are listed here. I'll tell you a little bit more about them as we go through the slides, but we're collecting ions, we're collecting isotopes, which really tell an interesting story about the age or the path that it had to take to get to the water or where it's situated, as well as things we measure in the field like pH, temperature, and specific conductivity. So here are 6 springs: Phantom Lake, Giffen, San Solomon, Saragossa, East Sandia, West Sandia, with some imagery of what field work in West Texas looks like. And it's not a bad office if you ask me, especially when you have helpers like Ron and Greg who don't hesitate for a moment to collect samples with me. So I also mentioned that an important part of a geochemical framework is that we're collecting over a broad spatial area. And so we've had the privilege, thanks to help from landowners, from the district, and from others in the community, to collect a great deal of samples for these really robust data in our study area. So those include 2 Capitan Reef wells that are located here in the Apache Mountains. Quite a few Edwards Trinity wells that are located along the Jeff Davis and Reeves County border. some Pecos Valley alluvium wells located in Balmorhea, and a Davis Mountains well here in the Davis Mountains. And so, if you recall that image that I showed of these large regional flow paths, you'll see that it's pretty coincident with our sampling is coincident with the flow paths that are right along the Stocks Fault coming from Culberson County. We tried to do some more sampling along the I-10 corridor and in Van Horn, but it was just not possible within the scope of this project. So we've collected these robust data, we send them to the lab, we make sure they're good quality before we interpret them, and then we're able to apply our geochemical and multivariate statistics. So we start off with major ion chemistry, and here is a picture, or excuse me, here's an image of what we use to visualize our data, a Piper diagram. And so it's essentially a way where we can plot all of our data into one graph to see how they relate to each other based on their assemblage. The different measurements or the different concentrations of ions, how do those compare to one another? So what stands out to me is that most of our samples, the Springs and the Edwards Trinity wells and the Capitan Reef wells that we've sampled, fall right in line in this area. It's really hard to segregate them. There's pretty similar chemistry amongst all of them, so it's not too helpful in possibly discriminating between different sources that may be contributing. Although there are a few that stand out, Saragossa has this wild behavior that is not in line with the rest of the samples. And this Davis Mountain sample has very different chemistry, which is what we might expect given past research in the area. And something I want you to take away from this, which will come up in a little bit, is the location of our samples on this Piper, right? It's right in line here at the 40 mark on the Piper, and we'll get back there, but just remember that it's right here. We talked earlier about salinity and total dissolved solids. So how do those compare amongst the springs over time? So I've created this box plot just to sort of visualize the ranges that we see in the springs. And so Giffen, Phantom Lake, and San Solomon have pretty similar chemistries in terms of TDS. They're brackish, but they average about 2,200. Our Sandias are consistently higher. They are more brackish than the rest of the samples. Whereas Saragossa has this really wide range of chemistry that doesn't really seem to fall with either one of them. So just as we're going through these plots, we're not necessarily trying to pin down a conclusion. We're just piecing together the different parts of the puzzle before we make any sort of conclusions. But plots like these can be really insightful. So we've looked at our ion chemistry using, some visual tools, but we can also use statistics to see if there are statistical relationships that may help to explain some of the differences. And so I'm not trying to throw any crazy terms out, but what I hope you'll take away from this is these statistics that we're using are just a way to figure out which ions are basically providing or tell us which account for the differences in the data. And I'll show you what I mean. So pictured here is a plot of the outcome of this statistical run. It's called a score plot. And so what I entered into the analysis are all the major ions. So there's 8 of them. But what it does is it gives me 2 components that explain the most variability. So what I mean by that is this first component, which is here on the x-axis, 68% of the variability can be accounted or attributed to our major ion data. So calcium, magnesium, sodium, 68% of the segregated data here can be explained by that. However, our second component includes silica and nitrate, which account for 15% of the variability. And so you aim to have about 80% variability, so this is a pretty insightful graph that we can then start to interpret. So based on the different components, this is kind of how we can classify the different trends of these data. But in short, what's obvious to me is that there are some clusters that may reflect, what we've already seen before. So Giffen, Phantom Lake, San Solomon cluster quite nicely together, which is what we've seen previously, as do the Sandias. And then there's also these Saragossa samples that don't really fall in line with anything, which again is what we've seen previously. Kind of does its own thing. There are also these other samples, Giffen, Phantoms, San Solomon, characterized by lower TDS, and East Sandia by higher TDS, that represent rain events. So the chemistry of these spring samples is changing whenever there's rain. In Giffen, Phantom Lake, and San Solomon, that means that the TDS gets lower. It's being diluted by that fresh rainwater, whereas something else is causing East Sandia to have a higher TDS after rain events. So again, we're just piecing the data together, just trying to see if we can come up with some ideas of where flow might be coming from. On top of that, our well data kind of trends in this similar area. You'll see that the Capitan Reef well, the Seven Hearts well, is right in line with the springs, and our Edwards wells and our other Capitan well trend towards the grouping of Giffen, Phantom Lake, and San Solomon. So we do we do our major ion chemistry. We use numerous tools to kind of better interpret the possible flow paths that might be coming. But then if we want to take a look or better understand the age or the history, isotopes can be really insightful, and I'll show you how. So first is pictured the isotopes of water. So deuterium being the isotope of hydrogen, and oxygen-18, of course, being the isotope of oxygen. And plotted here is something called the global meteoric waterline. And it's basically just a linear relationship between these two isotopes and how they may interact or how they may plot with respect to different recharge events. What is the altitude of the rain? What is the location? Is it humid? Is it arid? It's just a general relationship that we can use to better understand the timing of recharge for our data. And then there was a study done in Pecos County that basically said that if your oxygen-18 value is less than -7.5, it likely indicates submodern recharge, or water that was recharged 20,000 years ago in a cooler climate. Whereas values that are greater, so in this direction, are modern, might be rainwater, it might be just relatively younger water that has this different signal. And so in short, we see that our Giffen, Phantom Lake, springs, and all of our wells are characterized by the submodern recharge component, whereas Saragossa, who has just had a mind of its own, is plotted here again separately with respect to the rest of the samples. We might also use carbon isotopes to better understand the age of the groundwater, how long it's been flowing through an aquifer. And in short, if your carbon-13 values are getting bigger, that means it's older. If your percent modern carbon values are getting lower, that means it's also getting lower. So you have this general relationship, which we might expect, where everything is trending down in both directions. So that makes sense if our samples are plotted along here, because it just means that it's all along the same flow path or the same sort of general direction of flow where everything is getting older. It's been in the system longer, so this is what we would expect. But we have these clusters again. Consistently, we see how these data segregate using these different tools. Giffen, Phantom Lake, and San Solomon, here's most of the samples, whereas these rain event samples kind of deviate from most of the other samples like we've seen previously. However, the Sandias are way off the mark of where I would expect them to be. I'd probably expect them for this carbon-13 value to be more in line with this trend. So it makes me wonder if there's some sort of modern or atmospheric component. Is there a recirculation of waters or something being added that is making the carbon isotopes jump off like it is here? Saragossa, yet again, doing its own thing. Really high percent modern carbon values, which are essentially air. So it's really a really high or really modern component that we're seeing in Saragossa consistently. And then on top of that, the rest of our well samples are really in line with these older waters and group quite nicely together. So we're seeing these different ways the data are segregating based on age, based on composition for ions, and so it kind of helps us piece together the puzzle. One more thing I'll show you, and then we'll get to the fun part. Strontium isotopes, just to keep it short, tell you about the rock it's coming from. The isotopes don't really change in groundwater, so it captures or it keeps the signal from the rock it's coming from. So it can be really helpful to differentiate between different rocks or different aquifers, because like I said before, we're dealing with a lot of limestone, we're dealing with a lot of similar host rocks. So using an isotope like strontium can help us to differentiate between those similar kinds of rocks. So just to keep it simple, here are our Capitan and the rest of our spring samples that are right in line with this higher range of strontium isotopes. Our Edwards Trinity is much lower, right in line with, in here. And our Pecos Valley well has a much lower signal. So it kind of helps us just, where is this strontium signal possibly coming from? Where are these high signals coming from? And for the springs, it looks like it's right in line with the Capitan Reef. So what does this all mean? Well, I decided upon doing all these crazy graphs to put everything into perspective in terms of the regional chemistry. I wanted to know if my data were just way off the mark and if I was making things up, or if the data we've collected fall in line with what we see in a regional context. So here's this Piper diagram, and here's where your homework comes in, where I asked you to remember where the samples were located that we collected. Oops. Remember they were right in line with here? This general chemistry, well, this area on the Piper diagram falls right in line with this area on the map. Okay, so this mixing line, which I see which is apparent by this ellipse, includes Capitan Reef wells, Edwards wells, and the springs. And it's right in line with that Stocks Fault, which has already been identified as a potential source of recharge. But there's a lot else going on too. Well, so what this means is that the general chemistry of the Capitan Reef, the Edwards Trinity, and San Solomon Springs is likely indicative of mixing along this Stocks Fault flow path pictured here. So I'm not saying I've identified this new source, but rather I think our data are just confirmatory that this is in fact an important source of recharge to the springs. However, previously, those studies identified the Wild Horse Flat as also being a source. And so they plot much differently on this Piper diagram, or in terms of their ion chemistry, than I might expect if it was a strong contributor to the springs. So here are these Wild Horse Flat samples, and they're kind of segregated, but they do end up where the springs are. So I don't have any data to exclude the bolsons from being a source for the springs. In fact, I think it probably does have a minor component, but nonetheless, I think this distinct chemistry plotted here may be indicative of a separate regional flow path that may recharge the springs, although the extent to which it is doing so, I'm not clear yet. But again, here's this distinct chemistry that may or may not be a major source. There's also this distinct grouping over here of Edwards and Volcanics wells that are situated in Jeff Davis County. And what I suspect is happening here is that these low TDS values and distinct chemistry suggest that This is probably a low permeability zone and is not a major source of recharge to the springs, which is again, or at least highlighted by the fact that it has very different chemistry and doesn't fall in line with the springs like I might expect. And lastly, there's another grouping here of Edwards wells. Kind of thought to myself, why are these segregated from the rest? But it turns out they're located here in Reeves County, and what I suspect is going on is that this is just a different flow path of the Edwards Trinity, that this particular area or region likely doesn't provide a huge source of recharge to the springs. So with all of that being said, I know I've thrown a lot of terms and graphs, and I myself am still trying to figure it out because it's a lot of data, but that's what we do. And what happens is we come to a refined conceptualization of our flow system. So what I take from all of this is that our isotopic compositions and regional chemistry is consistent with the conceptual model that older groundwater from a regional flow system upwells along the Stocks Fault from the Capitan through carbonates, specifically the Edwards Trinity, to discharge at the springs. I think the elevated ion concentrations and carbon isotopes are indicative of mixing of water, likely a modern component that is added by either irrigation return flow or precipitation that increases the TDS and gives it a modern signal. So a separate local flow component to East and West Sandia. Saragossa is the black sheep and is likely just influenced by a near surface component. And then the chemistry has shown us that San Solomon, Phantom, and Giffen receive another local flow path from rain events. And as I mentioned, this is focused on San Solomon, but we're doing the same kind of work out in Fort Stockton. Here's a map of Pecos County, and here are all the wells we've had the opportunity to sample so that we can do similar work to better understand where the springs in Fort Stockton are coming from. So in summary, the geochemical signatures of groundwater can be used as indicators of different components to flow to springs. It can be especially useful for characterizing different sources that contribute to multi-outlet spring systems like San Solomon. San Solomon provides an example of a multi-outlet spring system, and through this study, we've showcased 4 different flow components, both local and regional, that likely contribute to the springs. I have to express my immense gratitude to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart Grant Program, which funded part of this work, as well as Greg Perrin, Ty Edwards, Robert Potts, Brian Smith, so many other people that made this work possible. And with all of that being said, I'll stop rambling and take any questions.
Real quick, so what I get out of this is that the majority of the water is older and slower to recharge.
Yes. And I suspect it's coming from that Stocks Fault region from Culberson County and flows along, structural features to feed the springs. But these waters are old. They're 20,000 years old. And of course, when you mix with younger waters, it kind of alters that signal, but these are older waters. And so if you have older waters, it's going to take a lot, if you're pumping a lot, and it will just take a lot longer to, replenish that to wherever you're focused on.
And some of the people that I talked to with especially the studies in Phantom Springs Cave and all, it more or less travels or comes from a west to northwest direction.
Sure.
So
and what's interesting is Phantom Lake has a little bit different chemistry. I mean, it's right in line with there, but similar to Comanche, Phantom Lake's water level has receded substantially, whereas we don't see that at San Solomon. So there's clearly some sort of flow path. There's something that's being intercepted that's causing reduction in Phantom Lakes that's not necessarily happening at San Solomon. So I don't know what that is, but, you know, that's part of it.
Yeah, can you conceptualize, maybe the development of the volume of the, you know, we have all these different sources, is there a concept of where most of it's coming, and I suspect Cat 10, but
Sure.
I'm wrong.
Well, in terms of volumes or percentages, the next step, so we have this conceptualization of what's happening. And now what we can do is something called a mixing model, where you try and determine what chemistries it would take and in what proportions to create the chemistry at the springs. So when that is completed, there will be, part of the project requires us to give another update in late May of next year. And so I hope you'll join us for that, because that's when I'll have those numbers to better ascertain what are the relative contributions from each. Is Wild Horse Flat really a strong contributor like others have thought, or is it 5% of flow? So I don't know yet, and I don't want to put numbers on if I, you know.
You got
That's-
your stuff.
yeah.
Sure.
Ms. Nunu, have you considered looking further up Reef for potential inflow as part of your inflow model?
In terms of Culberson County, like going further north?
Yes, ma'am, further up the Reef.
Sure, absolutely. We're exploring, you know, all possible areas that sampling could be filled in to fill in some of our data gaps. It's challenging accessing some of these, and so I think the fact that we've collected this many wells in this area is just a testament to landowners that are encouraged by this work and want to be a part of it, but it's absolutely something we're considering. There's no longer funding that's available to sample more for this project, but what we hope to do is sample in the future so that we can explore some of these areas, like further up the Reef in Culberson County, Van Horn, along the I-10 corridor, just to better constrain flow. So, I hope that answers your question.
You referenced this water being old at 20,000 years. For context, can you say at least in Texas, what young water would be that recharges quickly?
That's a good question. If I see a well that has only a couple hundred years to its age, I'd probably consider that to be young. But I think it all just depends on context. How is water getting in it just depends on the particular area you're focused on. So it's hard to say. These are old. 20,000 years is quite a long age or flow path, but if I see something that's a couple hundred years old, that's usually when I say that's probably a pretty young or modern source of water.
Is that water that y'all are researching up there around the springs, is that the same aquifer that feeds what we call a farm belt that comes north down through Reeves County? All the old water wells?
I don't know. Oh, no. I don't think that the Pecos Valley is a strong contributor to the springs. I can pause here. So here's the Pecos Valley in purple. And so a lot of the isotope data indicate to me that the Pecos Valley is not a strong source of recharge to the springs, which makes sense because the Pecos Valley is down gradient from, where we've been sampling and from, where the springs discharge.
Where does that water come from, the Pecos Valley?
In terms of,
The underground water that recharges?
well, this is an unconfined aquifer. So a lot of that water does come from rainfall. So water seeps in and is able to recharge through rain events. And there's upwelling too, that likely contributes or is contributed by the Edwards Trinity, which is underlying. So it's just a testament to how complex these areas are.
There's several other scientists in the area, but what they tell me is most of the recharge in Pecos Valley and all, like you're saying, comes from northern, even into New Mexico and further north. Slowly get down here. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. There's a pretty good USGS publication on the recharge of that aquifer coming from the river system, the ancestral river system.
Thank you.
Thank you.